Why do you think that Joe Biden is trying to sue the Department of Justice, former President Joe Biden, to have his tapes that he did interviews on blocked from the American people hearing them? Do you think that he's trying to hide something? And maybe Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche could comment on if they will countersue and release those tapes to the American public.
Are you talking about it with respect to his book?
With respect to his
memoirs. I'd like to see it. I don't know. Maybe there's some constitutional reason. I don't know. I would like to see what he has to say, because we can never allow what happened to this country to happen. The man was grossly incompetent, and the Democrats, I call them the Democrats because the policy is so bad, but they came very close to destroying our country. We can never let it happen again, and I hope that you're able to produce that. I think it would be a very interesting reading for people.
President Trump speaking at the cabinet meeting last week, talking about those Biden tapes. Biden is suing to keep them from being released. And our next guest says, release the Biden tapes and let Americans hear the truth for themselves. We welcome Gregg Jarrett to the show, Fox News legal analyst, former defense attorney and law professor, and also author. Thank you for being with us today, Greg. It's good to have you back on the show.
Oh, good to be with you, Annie.
So talk to us, maybe just a dash of a precursor of what tapes we're talking about, and then we can get into why maybe President Biden would like America to not see and hear what is in them.
Well, for a couple of decades, maybe more, Joe Biden was stealing classified documents. First, as a senator, he would take them home and keep them, which by itself is the Espionage Act. You know, these are top secret documents. You cannot take them outside of what's known as a SCIF, a secure location. Yet he kept taking them home, and I guess he wanted to use them for books that he was going to have a ghostwriter write. He did it as vice president. He was always given these thick notebooks of classified documents, and his staff always worried because after they gave it to him, those books would vanish. And of course, they were all found at 3 locations eventually, at his home, his office, his garage. I mean, just stacked full of classified documents. And, it was miraculous how Biden avoided being charged. It reeked of favoritism at the DOJ mixed with a corrupt cover-up. Because as I just described them, the crimes were so blatant. Troves of classified documents. Then he compounds the felonies by sharing them with a ghostwriter. Well, now he wants to keep those tapes concealed, hidden from both Congress and the American people. And he claims, erroneously, that these are private, personal recordings. No, they're not. That's not what the law says, because they were obtained lawfully by consent in a criminal investigation. So Biden does not have a privacy right under the Fourth Amendment. The tapes are in the public and prosecutorial domain. That strips away any privacy protections under the law, and I suspect the judge is going to rule that way.
So we're talking about that. So these are the tapes that are in discussion here, and President Biden, as I understand it, has sued to make sure that those tapes, the investigation into what you've just described here, that those tapes do not become public. What could possibly be so wrong if Joe Biden, they didn't end up prosecuting him, if they become public? I mean, it seems like he's off the hook. What could be so bad about America hearing these tapes?
Well, I think Biden doesn't want the American public or Congress to hear his failing mental health. There is one person who has listened to the tapes, and that's the Special Counsel Robert Hur, who in the end said, what Biden did was willful, it was intentional, it's a violation of the Espionage Act. He would normally be charged, but with a capital B, Biden is a, quote, sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory, end of quote. So in other words, according to the special counsel, Joe Biden did not have the mental capacity for a state of willfulness under the law. And of course, that is an inane paradox. So a man who is supposedly incompetent to stand trial is perfectly competent to be president of the United States and at the time running for another year term. And that's insane. Of course, that defies common sense and logic. So the fix was in. It was, Hur was reporting to Merrick Garland's Department of Justice, which was running a protection racket for Joe Biden. Now, all of that has ended, and Biden, has run to the nearest federal court to try to stop the release, and I just don't think it's going to work.
Is there some sort of executive privilege? I mean, President, when people compare... This is kind of a twofold question. When people compare at the same time this classified documents investigation that was going into Joe Biden and his classified documents in boxes in his garage to the same type of investigation that was going on at President Trump's home at Mar-a-Lago, who was a former president at the time, there was an executive privilege distinction that existed maybe in one place or the other. Does Joe Biden have some sort of executive privilege because he was the president at the time that applies to keeping these tapes hidden?
Well, the privilege arises out of a law known as the Presidential Records Act, and it allows former presidents, to maintain records. And in fact, it has been a 2-decade-long position by the Department of Justice, dating back to Bill Clinton, that a former president can keep whatever he wants. Now, Joe Biden cannot avail himself of that because the theft of documents occurred when he was a senator and as a vice president. So he doesn't have the protection under the Presidential Records Act that Donald Trump did. The juxtaposition, as I wrote in my column recently, is pretty stark. Donald Trump had his home raided by the FBI for documents he was entitled to keep under the Records Act. But, at the same time, Joe Biden was given a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's one of the reasons I think why Americans have increasingly come to distrust our system of justice. They see two sets of rules, one for everybody else, one for Donald Trump. And they've lost faith in our legal system. I don't blame them. I have too.
Yeah. It is a struggle to just assume that there is a set of standards that's going to apply to President Trump and everyone else. And, of course, people who support President Trump feel, by way of extension, that double standard applies to them as well. If these tapes were to be released and potentially expose, like you have in your article here, why was Biden spared? The most obvious explanation was his perceived senility. If that were to be exposed, does it beg the question about further investigation into who was protecting that perceived senility? Does it lead us to another question that would deserve another answer?
Well, you could only be prosecuted if you were lying about his mental health under oath. Lying to the public is not a crime, although sometimes I feel like it should be, which means everybody in Washington would be behind bars. They're all liars. And, my friends in Washington aren't going to like that, but I've watched it unfold for the better part of 5 decades as a reporter. Look, I think these tapes will reveal senility, dementia, some sort of, declining mental acuity. That was intimated by the Special Counsel Robert Hur, who listened to the tapes. But mostly it just shows criminality, because you hear Joe Biden telling the ghostwriter for 2 separate books in 2007 and 2017, I have classified documents. Let me go get them. And he goes and gets them, and he reads from them verbatim. Well, you can't share classified information with somebody who has no security clearance whatsoever. That is also a crime. So it was a twofold crime by Joe Biden. Stealing classified records, keeping them in an unauthorized place. But second of all, sharing it with somebody who has no security clearance. These are sort of the same things that Hillary Clinton should have been prosecuted for, because she housed classified top secret documents in her home, which was unauthorized. And in fact, James Comey at the time stood in front of cameras and said she clearly committed crimes. And then he made up a standard that doesn't exist when he said, but no reasonable prosecutor would ever bring such a case, which is ludicrous because every prosecutor in America would love to bring that case against Hillary Clinton because it was a slam dunk. She had him in her home, period. And it's not just intentionally doing so, but under the statute, it's also gross negligence. So at the very least, it was reckless and negligent.
Do you have an expected timeline as to when we might get access to these tapes, if we do?
No, I really don't. It is up to the judge, and the judge is someone who was appointed among the first of Donald Trump's appointments to the federal bench back in 2017, his first year in office. She hasn't given indication. We haven't even had a hearing in court, so it's going to be some time. The briefs were fairly only half the briefs are in, fairly lengthy, and the response brief is going to be lengthy as well. So there's no way to know.
Last question before we let you go, and I just wanted to ask you your thoughts and anticipation on the Supreme Court ruling on birthright citizenship. My understanding is we should get it by the end of the month, a little bit earlier in May. President Trump kind of quipped about saying it would be a disgrace if the Supreme Court of the United States allowed that to happen. Remember what I said, 20 to 25% of the people coming into our country will come in through birthright citizenship. It almost seemed as though he was laying the groundwork to maybe hear a ruling from the Supreme Court that he didn't like. I'm just wondering your thoughts on this pending ruling.
I talked to him about it. He's not terribly optimistic that he's going to prevail on that. I wrote a column the first month of his presidency, second term, in which I argued that he really does have a valid argument on birthright citizenship. I went back to the period of time in which that constitutional amendment was crafted, and I read the legislative history, and the sponsors of it made it abundantly clear that it was not meant for the purpose that it has come to be, for children of people who are here illegally. And if you read their remarks on the record, it's clear. But as I listened to the oral arguments recently at the Supreme Court, that didn't seem to resonate with them. And I'm mystified and bewildered why it didn't. It should have won the day. So I think they're heading in the opposite direction, and Trump may not win this one.
Do you anticipate that it will be close, one way or the other?
Yeah, no way to know, really. Often you can easily read the tea leaves during oral arguments. This one, I couldn't do that. So it's really hard to know what the vote will be. I tend to doubt it's going to be unanimous.
All right. Well, Gregg Jarrett, always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insight. We're grateful for it.
Anytime, Annie. Take care.
You as well. Bye-bye.